You do not need more discipline. You're using the wrong tool. The exhaustion nobody talks about. There's a specific kind of tiredness that doesn't come from working too much. It doesn't come from late nights, long hours, or physical effort. It comes from something quieter and far more corrosive. The daily act of forcing yourself to do what you believe you should do, while some part of you resists with everything it has. You know this feeling? Maybe you've felt it this morning. The alarm goes off. You lie there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to gather enough internal force to start another day of pushing. Not because you're lazy, not because you don't care, but because something inside you is tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And the worst part? You've been told the solution your entire life. More discipline, more structure, more willpower. Wake up earlier, build better habits, try harder. Push through. And for a while you do. You build the routine, you follow the system. You white-knuckle your way through the resistance. And then weeks later, sometimes days, and the whole thing collapses. And you're back to the beginning, carrying one more piece of evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you. But what if nothing is wrong with you? What if the problem isn't the amount of discipline you have, but the fact that discipline was the wrong tool from the beginning? Think about that for a moment. Not as a comforting idea, as a real possibility. Because there's a difference, a massive underestimated difference, between the exhaustion that comes from genuine effort and the exhaustion that comes from internal resistance. The first kind builds something. It leaves you tired but intact. You feel it in your body after a hard day of work that actually meant something to you. It's honest, it's proportional. The second kind is different. It accumulates silently. It doesn't come from how much you did. It comes from the constant internal friction between what you're forcing yourself to do and what you actually believe matters. You can spend an entire day being productive by every external measure and still feel completely hollow by the end of it. Not because you didn't work hard enough, because you were fighting yourself the entire time. Most people never separate these two experiences. They treat all resistance as the same problem, a character flaw to be overcome with more force, more discipline, more grit. But the Stoics understood something that took centuries to forget. Marcus Aurelius didn't write the Meditations to motivate himself. He wrote them to see himself clearly, to understand the nature of his own resistance before deciding how to respond to it, not to push harder, to perceive more accurately. And that distinction between force and perception is exactly what most modern conversations about discipline completely miss. This video is not going to tell you to try harder. It's not going to give you a better morning routine or a more efficient productivity system. It's going to do something more uncomfortable than that. It's going to ask you to look at the tool you've been using, the one you were told was the answer, and consider the possibility that it was never designed for the problem you're actually trying to solve. Because discipline is a tool, a real one, a useful one. But like every tool, it has a specific purpose. And when you use it outside that purpose, when you reach for it by default for every obstacle, every resistance, every gap between who you are and who you want to be, it doesn't just stop working. It starts doing damage. And the damage is quiet enough that most people never connect it to the tool itself. They just feel increasingly tired, increasingly stuck, and increasingly convinced that the problem is them. It isn't. The problem is the tool. And there is another one. What discipline actually is and what it isn't. The word discipline comes from the Latin disciplina, which originally meant instruction, learning, a system of knowledge passed from one person to another. It had nothing to do with force, nothing to do with suppression. It described the process of a mind being shaped by understanding. Somewhere along the way, that meaning collapsed. What we call discipline today is almost entirely about resistance, about overriding the impulse, about making yourself do what the impulse doesn't want to do. The cultural image of a disciplined person is someone who feels the desire to stop, and doesn't stop. Someone who feels the pull toward comfort and moves toward discomfort instead. Someone who is essentially at war with themselves on a daily basis. And we've decided this is a virtue. But look closely at that image, really look at it. What it describes is not a person in harmony with their own direction. It's a person in constant internal conflict, winning that conflict through superior force. And we celebrate that, we sell it. We build entire industries around it. The problem is not that self-control is useless, it isn't. The problem is what happens when self-control becomes the primary mechanism through which a person tries to change their life. Because discipline, in the modern sense, is a finite resource, not metaphorically, literally. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for override and inhibition, fatigues with use. Every act of forced resistance draws from the same cognitive reservoir. By the time you've white-knuckled your way through the first 3 items on your list, the 4th is already harder, not because you're weak, because you're human. And the Stoics knew this, not in neurological terms but in observational ones. They watched what happened to men who relied entirely on force to govern themselves. They didn't become stronger, they became brittle, consistent on the surface, fragile underneath, performing discipline rather than embodying it. Epictetus makes a distinction in the Discourses that most readers pass over too quickly. He separates the man who controls himself through effort from the man who no longer needs that effort, because his perception of what matters has changed so fundamentally that the wrong action simply loses its appeal. The first man is disciplined, the second man is something else entirely. And here's the uncomfortable truth that most self-improvement content never says out loud. For most people in most areas of their lives, discipline is not the real problem. Alignment is. Think about the areas of your life where consistency comes naturally, where you don't need to force yourself, where you don't need reminders or systems or accountability partners, where the action happens almost automatically because something inside you genuinely wants the outcome. You don't experience those areas as requiring discipline. You experience them as being part of who you are. Now think about the areas where you constantly struggle, where you build routines that collapse, where you need more and more force to produce the same behavior, where the resistance never really goes away no matter how long you've been trying. The difference between those 2 categories is not discipline. It's something deeper, something the Stoics had a name for, and it changes the entire diagnosis. What the Stoics used instead. Marcus Aurelius was not a monk. He was not living in a controlled environment, free from temptation and distraction, where discipline was easy because nothing threatened it. He was the most powerful man in the known world, surrounded by excess, flattery, political violence, and every conceivable reason to act poorly. And yet he governed himself with a consistency that still feels almost inhuman 2,000 years later. Epictetus owned nothing. He had no power over his own body, his own time, his own circumstances. He was a slave. And from that position, he developed a philosophy of internal freedom so precise and so durable that it outlasted every empire that surrounded him. Neither of them talked about discipline the way you've been taught to think about it. What they talked about, obsessively from every angle, was perception, the quality of attention a person brings to their own inner life. Not what they do, but how clearly they see what they're doing and why. In Stoic philosophy, there is a concept called fantasia, the impression. It refers to the way reality presents itself to the mind before the mind decides how to respond. Every action, every impulse, every moment of resistance or compliance begins here, not in the will but in the impression, in how a situation appears to you before you've consciously processed it. Epictetus argues throughout the Discourses that the fundamental work of a human being is not to control behavior directly. It is to examine and correct the impressions that generate behavior in the first place. To look at what the mind sees and ask, is this accurate? Is this perception aligned with what I actually value? Or is it a distortion, shaped by fear, habit, or the expectations of others? This is not motivational language. It is a precise psychological diagnosis. And it leads to something the modern discipline conversation almost never reaches, the distinction between enkrateia and sophrosyne. The enkrateia is self-control through force, the will overriding the impulse. This is what most people mean when they say discipline. And the Stoics respected it. They considered it necessary at certain stages of development, but they never considered it the destination. Sophrosyne is something else. It's usually translated as temperance or moderation, but those translations miss the deeper meaning. Sophrosyne is the state in which a person no longer needs to override their impulses with force, because their understanding of what matters has become clear enough that the wrong action genuinely loses its pull. Not suppressed, not overridden, simply no longer appealing in the way it once was. The difference is not subtle. It is the difference between a man who doesn't eat the sugar because he's forcing himself not to, and a man who doesn't eat the sugar because he's looked clearly enough at what it costs him that the desire itself has diminished. One of those men is exhausted by the effort. The other barely notices it. This is what Marcus Aurelius was building every morning in the pages of the Meditations. Not motivation, not a pep talk. Clarity. The slow, deliberate work of seeing his own life with enough precision that right action became the natural response, not the forced one. And here is where the real question begins to form. Because if this is the tool, if perception and alignment are what actually drive consistent action, then why is it so hard to access? Why does the struggle persist even in people who understand all of this intellectually? Because there is something blocking it, something specific, something most people are carrying without knowing it has a name. The real blocker, misaligned perception. Here is something most people never say out loud, even to themselves. A significant portion of what you're forcing yourself to do every day, the goals you're chasing, the habits you're building, the version of yourself you're trying to become, was never fully chosen by you. Not in the deepest sense of the word, it was assembled, piece by piece over years, from the expectations of people whose approval once felt essential to your survival. From cultural definitions of success that you absorbed before you were old enough to question them, from comparisons you made when you were young and insecure, and decided quietly what kind of person you needed to become to feel acceptable. And now you're trying to discipline yourself into a life that was partly designed by other people's fears. That's not a character flaw, that's the human condition. But it explains something that no productivity system ever will, why the resistance never fully disappears, no matter how much structure you build around it. Because the resistance is not laziness, it is not weakness, it is a signal, a specific intelligent signal from the part of you that knows, even when you don't want to admit it, that some of what you're forcing yourself toward was never really yours to begin with. Epictetus called this the corruption of the fantasia, the impression. When the mind has been shaped by external pressure long enough, it begins to see the world through a distorted lens. It mistakes other people's values for its own. It pursues outcomes that produce recognition, but not meaning. It builds lives that look correct from the outside and feel hollow from the inside. And then it reaches for discipline to fill the gap. But discipline cannot fill that gap. It can cover it temporarily. It can generate enough momentum to look like progress for a while. But underneath, the misalignment remains, and it drains energy continuously. The way a small leak drains a tank. You keep refilling with effort, with structure, with accountability, and the level never quite stays where you need it to be. This is why so many people who are genuinely hardworking, genuinely intelligent, genuinely motivated, still feel stuck. Not because they lack discipline, because they're applying enormous amounts of energy to a direction that was never fully examined. Marcus Aurelius returns to this again and again in the Meditations, not with dramatic language, with quiet, almost clinical precision. He keeps asking himself the same essential question in different forms. Is this actually mine? Is this impulse coming from reason and genuine value, Or is it coming from habit, from image, from the fear of what others will think? He doesn't ask this once, he asks it daily, because he understood that perception doesn't correct itself automatically. It requires deliberate, repeated examination. The mind left alone will always default to the familiar, even when the familiar is the source of the problem. And here is the part that makes this genuinely uncomfortable. Most people, when they feel resistance, immediately assume the resistance is the enemy. They reach for more force, more structure, more accountability. They build systems to bypass the resistance rather than stopping to ask what the resistance is actually telling them. But what if the resistance is the most honest voice in the room? What if it's not telling you that you're weak, but that something in the direction you've chosen doesn't align with what you actually value at the deepest level? That question is not comfortable. It's not supposed to be. Because if it's true, and for many people it is, then the solution is not more discipline. The solution is a level of honesty about your own life that most people spend enormous amounts of energy avoiding. And avoiding it has a cost. There's specific, measurable cost that accumulates over time, a cost that most people are already paying, without ever connecting it to its real source. Why forcing yourself is slowly breaking you. There's a promise built into the modern discipline narrative that almost nobody examines directly. The promise is this: the more you force yourself, the easier it gets. Resistance decreases with repetition. Push through long enough and the behavior becomes automatic. The friction disappears. You become the person who doesn't need to try anymore, because trying has become identity. It's a compelling promise, and for a narrow category of actions, genuinely aligned with what you value. It's even partially true. But for everything else, the opposite happens. When you repeatedly force yourself to do something your mind associates with high internal cost, not physical effort, but emotional resistance, misalignment, the feeling of moving against your own grain, your brain doesn't learn to make that action easier. It learns to associate that action with threat, with depletion, with something to be avoided. This is not a motivational observation. It's a description of how aversive conditioning works. Every time you white-knuckle your way through a behavior that feels fundamentally wrong, you are reinforcing the neural association between that behavior and discomfort. You're not building a habit. You're building an aversion with a layer of forced compliance on top of it, and over time that layer gets heavier, not lighter. But the cost that concerns the Stoics most is not neurological, it's deeper than that. It's what happens to a man's relationship with himself when forcing becomes his primary mode of operation. Seneca writes in the Letters to Lucilius about the difference between a man who acts from genuine conviction and a man who acts from compulsion, even self-imposed compulsion. He observes that the second man gradually loses access to his own interior. He becomes so focused on the external performance of correct behavior that he stops examining whether the behavior is actually correct for him. He confuses compliance with integrity. He confuses effort with virtue. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he stops trusting his own perception. This is the hidden cost that nobody puts on the productivity spreadsheet, not the burnout, though burnout is real and it comes, not the collapse of the routine, though that comes too. It's the gradual erosion of self-knowledge, the slow disconnection from your own inner signal system, the one that knows the difference between genuine resistance and the laziness you're afraid it is. When you override that system often enough, you stop hearing it clearly. And then you're navigating without instruments. You probably know someone who has reached this point. Maybe you've been there yourself. The person who has optimized every external variable, sleep, nutrition, schedule, environment, and still feels fundamentally lost. Not because they haven't tried hard enough, because they've tried so hard for so long, in a direction that was never fully theirs, that they no longer know what their own direction actually feels like. Marcus Aurelius saw this pattern in the men around him, men of enormous external discipline and internal emptiness. And the Meditations read carefully, are in part a sustained effort to not become that, to keep the interior alive while managing the exterior demands of an empire. He understood that force, applied without clarity, doesn't build character. It hollows it out. So the question is no longer whether you need to try. Of course you do. The question is what you're trying toward, and whether the tool you've been using to get there is actually capable of taking you where you want to go. Because there is a different tool, and it doesn't ask you to try less, it asks you to see more clearly first. The right tool. Clarity before action. Everything changes when you stop asking, how do I force myself to do this, and start asking, why does this actually matter to me? Not as a motivational exercise, not as a journaling prompt you fill out once and forget, as a genuine recurring act of examination, the kind Marcus Aurelius practiced every morning, not because he was weak, but because he understood that perception drifts, that without deliberate attention, the mind defaults to noise, to urgency, to habit, to the loudest external signal available. The Stoics called this practice prosoche, attention to oneself. It is not introspection for its own sake. It is the deliberate act of returning regularly to the question of what you actually value, and measuring the distance between that and what you're currently doing. That distance is the real data, not how disciplined you are, not how many days you've maintained the streak, not how early you wake up, or how efficiently you move through your schedule. The real data is the gap, or the absence of a gap, between what you genuinely believe matters and how you're actually spending your life. When that gap is large, no system closes it. You can build the most sophisticated productivity architecture in the world, and it will eventually collapse under the weight of the misalignment beneath it. Because behavior that contradicts deep values is not a habit problem, it is a perception problem. And perception problems don't respond to behavioral solutions. But when that gap is small, when you've done the honest, uncomfortable work of examining what actually matters to you and aligning your actions toward it, something shifts that no productivity book will ever fully capture. The action still requires effort. Don't misread this. Clarity doesn't eliminate difficulty. What it eliminates is the specific, draining friction of moving against yourself. The effort that remains is clean, proportional. It builds rather than depletes. Epictetus describes this in the Discourses with a precision that is almost startling. He says that when a person's prohairesis, their faculty of choice, their capacity for reasoned intention, is properly oriented, action flows from that orientation the way water flows downhill. Not effortlessly, but naturally, without the constant internal war that characterizes a life built on force rather than alignment. This is what Marcus Aurelius was building every morning in the Meditations, not motivation, not discipline in the modern sense. He was calibrating his perception, returning to what he actually believed, measuring the distance between his values and his intentions for the day ahead. And doing this not once, not in a moment of crisis, but as a daily, deliberate, unglamorous practice. The tool is not harder than discipline. In many ways, it's more demanding, because it requires a quality of honesty that force never does. Discipline lets you avoid the question of whether you're moving in the right direction. Clarity forces you to answer it. But the return on that honesty is unlike anything that more willpower ever produced, because a man who knows clearly why something matters to him doesn't need to be forced toward it. He needs to be given the space to move. And the primary obstacle in his way is rarely effort. It's usually everything that has accumulated between him and a clear view of his own direction. Which brings us to something the Stoics were precise about, and that most modern conversations about clarity never reach. Because knowing that misalignment exists is not the same as knowing where to find it. And knowing where to find it is not the same as knowing what to do when you do. That gap between recognizing the problem and actually moving through it is where most people get stuck a second time, not from lack of discipline, from lack of a specific practice, And that practice has a name. Where to begin the Stoic practice of misalignment? There is a version of this conversation that ends with a list. 7 steps to better habits, a morning routine, a journaling template, something you can implement tomorrow and measure by the end of the week. This is not that version. Not because practical tools are useless, they aren't, but because giving you a system before you've examined the misalignment underneath your current one would be doing exactly what this entire video has been arguing against. It would be handing you a new layer of discipline to place over a problem that discipline was never designed to solve. So instead, here is where you actually begin, not with a new habit, with a question. One question, asked honestly, about one specific area of your life where the resistance has been persistent, where you've tried and rebuilt and tried again and the struggle never fully resolves, where you've blamed yourself enough times that the blame itself has become background noise. The question is this: is what I'm forcing myself toward actually mine? Not, is it good, or not, is it reasonable? Not, would other people approve? Those are the wrong questions, and you've been answering them your whole life. The question is whether this direction, this goal, this version of yourself you're trying to build, whether it comes from something you've genuinely examined and chosen, or whether it was inherited, absorbed, assumed without inspection. Marcus Aurelius practiced this in the Meditations with a consistency that is almost uncomfortable to read. He didn't ask it dramatically. He asked it quietly, methodically, the way a carpenter checks a surface for level, not because he expected the answer to always be reassuring, but because he understood that an unexamined direction, pursued with enormous effort, produces an enormous amount of movement toward the wrong place. Epictetus, in the Discourses, describes this practice as the foundation of everything else. Before you work on behavior, examine the impression. Before you build the system, examine the value underneath it, not once, regularly. Because the mind drifts, because external pressure is constant, because without deliberate return to what you actually believe, you will always be at risk of optimizing someone else's life with your own energy. This is prosauche, attention to oneself, not navel-gazing, not endless self-analysis that leads nowhere. A specific, disciplined practice of returning to the question of direction before working on the question of speed. Here is what that looks like in practice. Pick one area, the one with the most persistent resistance, not the easiest one, the most honest one. And instead of asking how to force yourself through it more effectively, ask something different. Ask what you actually believe the outcome is worth. Ask whether the version of yourself you'd become by achieving it is a version you genuinely want to inhabit, or a version you've decided you should want because of what it would signal to others. Sit with that question long enough to feel the discomfort of an honest answer, because the honest answer will tell you something that no productivity system ever will. It will tell you whether you need a better strategy, or whether you need to examine the direction itself. And that distinction is not small. It is the difference between spending the next 5 years building the wrong thing with extraordinary efficiency and spending the next 5 years building something that actually matters to you with ordinary, sustainable effort. The Stoics were not against effort. They were against wasted effort. Effort spent moving in a direction that was never examined, toward a destination that was never genuinely chosen, using a tool that was never designed for the real problem. You don't need more discipline. You need to look more clearly at what you're applying it to. And once you see that clearly, once the misalignment becomes visible rather than just felt, the right action tends to become less about force and more about inevitability. Not easy, but aligned. And aligned effort, even when it's hard, doesn't hollow you out. It builds something that lasts longer than any streak. Something that doesn't collapse the moment the structure around it is removed. Something that is, in the deepest sense, actually yours. That is where the Stoics were pointing all along. Not toward a harder version of the life you're already living, toward a clearer one. And if you made it to this point, if something in this video landed in a way that felt less like information and more like recognition, then you already know what the next step is. It's not a new habit. It's not a new system. It's one honest question about one specific area of your life. Ask it tonight. Before you build anything new, before you reach for more discipline, ask it first. And if you've stayed until here, maybe this video touched something that usually goes unnoticed, in the middle of everything else pulling at your attention. So if it meant something to you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. I read every single one by one. Because more often than not, the next video comes from there. From the experiences you share. From the things you're carrying that almost nobody manages to put into words. And maybe the most important thing about this channel is the quiet recognition that you are not the only one living this kind of internal conflict in silence. Thank you for being here, for your attention, for the time you chose to spend here today. See you in the next one.